Welcome to Journey of Anesthete podcast. This is part of our book lunch series, and this is a mini series we're doing, of course, as we approach our second episode of a show on Joan Didion and her husband, fellow writer John Gregory Dunne. And we're going to have a special. First of all, the sound. I want to check in with Laurie and see how the sound is. Hope everything's clear. That's important. A special emphasis on her last work. I think there was one little text after BlueNights. And BlueNights, of course, concerns, much like the book that preceded it, Year of Magical Thinking. It's about personal loss. And so, in her life, of her daughter, Quintana Roo, who was adopted in the 60s. I should say firstly, that I am the same generation as late Quintana, Generation X. She was born in 66. I was born in 67. I survived. She unfortunately passed. Lifestyles took different turns. And like many fellow Gen Xers, our parents were the silent generation. That is, they were not boomer, usually not boomer parents if we're older, but parents who had been born in the 1930s, and this is no exception in this case, of these personalities. Now, the first episode, I wanted to go back in time to a very rare reading of a Book of Common Prayer. I'm just getting this up to speed here and where we are. And there's an opportunity. Is Joan Didion's very first public performance reading of a novel, brand new novel, in 1977 at a poetry center, I believe somewhere in Stanford or Berkeley. Well, actually, I think it was in Los Angeles. And I showed that to get a sense of her reading. And we're going to start off this episode with a similar move. We're going to show, unlike the Poetry Center clip, this is a commercially produced mass market network television concoction of Tom Brokaw and the folks at NBC. Very similar to shows like 60 Minutes. And we're going to show, I call it a concoction. It's very artificial because it is network television. It's a little, I put this in quotes, less real perhaps, or less forthcoming than other accounts. Certainly the accounts of her private diaries to a psychiatrist and her husband. But still, it's interesting. One of the things we discuss on this podcast that's important to me and should be important to everybody is retro design. Retro culture, cultures of the past, near past especially, how network television presented this married couple as writers. And so I'm going to play a little bit of this. Now, the Copyright Act of 1976, bicentennial year, is our friend. And I invoke it here to say that the material is used for the purpose of commentary and criticism, which falls under, and here it goes, most famous clause, the fair use doctrine. Fair use doctrine phrase of copyright law. No copyright infringement is ever intended. And that's our disclaimer from our friend, the Copyright Act of 76. And so I'm going to play a little bit of this. I think it's from 78, 79. I'm not exactly sure. Late 70s. And it's like a profile that network television did in those days. I'm going to play a little bit to get a feeling, as we did our first episode, to get a feeling of the era, where people come from. And after that, in this episode, we're going to dive very deeply into prose. Above all, syntax and style. Syntax and style, prose style, are what writing is about. And I'm going to be a little more polemical and say that it is never a transparent affair. By which I mean the emotions that syntax, a particular kind of syntax, remember parataxis or hypotaxis, short declarative sentences of subject and verb versus longer sentences in high style with lots of subordinate clauses. These decisions a writer makes create feelings and emotions in the reader. And why I say it's not entirely transparent is that the way we're going to look at writing here, the way we've always looked at everything we've done in Book Lunch when it involves writing, is not for the writing to be a vehicle for paraphrasing or translation, which would be the transparent point of view. You know, you read a text to find out scientific data about, I don't know, facts of the world, facts of a biography of Joan Didion or John Gregory Dunne. No, writing at the level we're dealing with in this episode, this high level, is about using the structure of sentences. So you have a sentence, you collect sentences into a paragraph. They are short, long paragraphs. You expand outward. Eventually you have a whole composition. An essay, a novel, a book. These are building blocks, and these building blocks create emotions. And so writing is one of the main things, not the only thing, of course. I mean, you could go to prose for information, which would be that you're not interested in the writing. You want to kind of get past the writing to get stuff, which is the way non-sentient entities created by us, namely ChatGPT, AI, machines, robots, computers, the way they, if they could be said to read. No, we're reading from the inside out, where it's not so much about transparency, but about creating effects in the reader. The same way a movie or a joke will create laughter or tears and create effects in a viewer. So that's my long-winded way of saying that's kind of where we're coming from, exploring how to do things with words, to quote the great J.L. Austin, with whom I mostly disagree, but I've read him, and he did have that great phrase, how to do things with words. And we're going to talk about how words make things happen, and to approach them with the aim of some kind of transparency is to leave the language behind, to leave writing itself behind, and go to a translation, like a summary or a synopsis. After all art is this struggle against the givenness of the world, against the, all art is rooted in, I would say, skepticism about transparency and an embrace of opacity, an embrace of not both and propositions and all these sorts of things. So I've talked too long. I hope it went into your synapses, your soul and your spirit, and made things happen. Let's watch this little television.
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
It's NBC. Now this symbol here was the peacock symbol that they used in the 70s and 80s. It's a really, that's what commercial institutions did. They had proud as a peacock, and there's their peacock, and Tom Brokaw is going to come on here and do this concocted way of talking to this couple in California Beach, and away we go. There it is.
About an hour's drive north of Los Angeles, she shares life along the coast of her native California with husband John Gregory Dunne, who is also a writer. They're a prolific literary pair, turning out essays on the California lifestyle, book reviews, novels, and even screenplays. It was Dunne's idea to bring back A Star is Born as a rock love story, and they wrote the initial screenplay. But it is Didion's work as an essayist and novelist that is most celebrated. This physically frail, reticent woman writes spellbinding prose in a style that is spare and occasionally sinister.
It's the only aggressive act it's the only way I can be aggressive.
Is there a transformation in Joan Didion from sitting here and moving into a typewriter? When you sit down at a typewriter, are you a different person?
Yeah, I'm totally in control. of this tiny, tiny world. Right there at the typewriter.
It becomes your world. You're more comfortable there than you are here, not just on a television interview, but
Yeah.
in almost any other situation.
Yeah. Actually, except in the most, I'm comfortable in the kitchen, I'm comfortable cooking, I'm comfortable performing in a way. I mean, I'm comfortable doing something.
How important is it to live here?
I like to look at the horizon. That is nice. It is always there flat. I like to live in California. I'm from here. I like to live in Los Angeles because it's neutral.
Now, when this interview was done in the late 70s, roughly the exact same time from Book of Common Prayer and the stuff I was talking about in our first episode of this series, I'm mindful of the fact that she also goes back and forth to New York. She in the late 80s, she moves to New York City. But she had already lived, of course, in New York working at Vogue in the 60s. And so she has this long career. And so I mentioned before I played this clip about writing and prose. And so expanding outward to subject matter. So you have the building blocks of sentences, paragraphs, subject, verb, prepositions, clauses, grammatical rules, habits and structures, all of that. And then you have subject. And Joan Didion has written about the Terry Schiavo right to die or not right to die, that case. Written about the Haight-Ashbury and slouching towards Bethlehem. The hippie movement and meeting the 4-year-old on LSD who, not to be gossipy, but some say is Courtney Love. I don't know. When Courtney Love was 4 years old. I'll have to ask Annalise about that. She's doing a biography of Courtney Love. Martha Stewart, Nancy Reagan, the Dukakis campaign and political fictions later on. Goodness, there's so much. John Wayne, a love song, love story, or love for John Wayne. Those are subjects. And also, with all of that, the subject of what it's like to move to New York as a Californian. What it's like to be a Californian. The grisly, sinister, tragic Donner Party and cannibalism, which connects to her, if you know that story. The West, and all of these things are subjects. And also subjects to are your husband dies. That's a subject. You adopt the girl in 1966, baby girl, and in her 50s, she, well, not 50s, wait, maybe, yeah, I'm trying to get the math right. She passes, unfortunately, and that's a subject. When we encounter John Donne's Vegas, which we will for fun mostly, later on in the series, there will be subjects like sex work, gambling, polyester tuxedos and ruffled shirts in the 70s, and bookies, and running numbers, and being a private PI, private detective. Those will be subjects. These are all subjects. And so a writer has to, if they're going to write, it's going to be a written text, has to figure out how they're going to negotiate most personal, somewhat personal, I could say that California and New York are big subjects for Joan Didion. I would say that those are as real, as personal, as life and death for her as Quintana. I can feel that from the writing, but that's just a guess. In terms of importance, because all the while being mindful that a human being, of course, is always like our animal companions and pets, if we have them, or family members, loved ones, even stray sexual partners, I don't know, as those are at the top of our concerns, of course, as opposed to abstract entities like a nation state or a town or a state or an island, a peninsula, and so on. But it's interesting. So I'm going to go way back in time and read from some of her writing on larger areas, just to get a sense. So I'm going to read from Goodbye to All That, which is one of the most imitated, parodied essays about saying goodbye to New York. I should say that when Joan Didion was deeply studying writing, she used to type out on a typewriter, Underwood or Burroughs typewriter, I don't know, Corona, these old typewriters, the sentences and paragraphs of Henry James, my personal favorite, and Ernest Hemingway, less favorite in my book. But both those authors, to see how to write. And Gia Gelantina, the reporter and journalist, when she was a teen and young woman, used to copy out Joan Didion sentences in paragraphs, which is why Gelantina is such a good, became the writer she is. And so it goes. Okay, so Goodbye to All That. There's also a Doris Lessing. Goodbye. Is it Mary McCarthy? My encyclopedic brain is, as we are in Mercury in retrograde. Don't say it, right? Or we can say it. As with Mercury in retrograde, it's causing me to forget authors of famous phrases. So, and this is in medias res, so flow of a text. Goodbye to All That. What year are we here? This is 1967, of course, the year of my birth. Now, it would be a long while, perhaps quite simply, I was in love with New York. So the context is a long while since what? So the paragraph above, it said, it would be a long while before I would come to understand the particular moral of the story. So one of the isocolons, right? One of the strategies to her style is repetition. She does this a lot. She increases it when she writes most personally in Blue-Nights. And this is, as I said, is connected to sacred and spiritual writing. It's parataxis. I'm sure I'm going to mix those up. Parataxis or hypotaxis. They're binary opposites. And so this is the parataxis prose is this and a this and a this and a this. And you repeat. Like if I, for example, right now I'm going to improvise something. They never told me such and such and such. Paragraph. They never told me such and such. It's a way to create a hypnotic rhythm of incantation, which connects it, of course, to the Bible. And so when you use techniques like that in secular writing or nominally secular writing like this, or like a book about the death of your kid, that does certain things. And it's about, again, the transparent view is I want words to help me recover from something. Most people hated Blue-Nights. Most reviewers. They feel it was not a text for use. That is, it was not transparent. It was a poetic expression of, what it's like to be a parent There's a passage I'm going to read about how you're always scared 24/7. What's going to happen? A monster, her little girl, night terrors, monster in the closet. Well, me, Mom, Joan Didion is worried about, overnight and friends and, being a parent. So it's not about how one, well, it is about how one lives with that. But it's not about solving anything. It's not scientific. It's spiritual in my clumsy, crude formulation there. And so it's that spirit that all art exists. But so I interrupted too much. So love, she says, she says, I do not mean love in any colloquial way. I mean that I was in love with the city. The way you love the first person who ever touches you. Get rid of this thing. I'm going to keep doing that all the time. Let me start off with some of these apologies. I mean that I was in love with the city the way you love the first person who ever touches you and never love anyone quite that way again. I remember walking across 62nd Street one twilight that first spring, or the second spring. They were all alike for a while. I was late to meet someone, but I stopped at Lexington Avenue and bought a peach and stood on the corner eating it and knew that I had to come out of the west and reach the mirage. I could taste the peach and feel the soft air blowing from the subway grating on my legs. Subway grating, Connie, in the city's urban living context. You have these little grates in the sidewalk and wind coming up, Marilyn Monroe and the dress blowing up and 7-Year Itch, for example, not to just to kind of context there. Grating on my legs, and I could smell lilac and garbage and expensive perfume, and I knew that it would cost something sooner or later because I did not belong there, did not come from there. But when you are 21 or 23, you figure that later you will have a high emotional balance and be able to pay whatever it costs. I'm going to sit with that. This is making complex. This is the aspect of her writing I very much admire. It's what I call philosophic and propositional. Now, she doesn't overdo it so that it becomes polemic, argument, proposition, but she's she's saying, well, this, when you're 20s, you do this, and when she's telling us. Not to solve it. It's not to not have anybody have a 20s like that. It's not to have future 20-somethings learn how to cope with being 20. No. Not for that. You can do that with her text if you so want to. That's certainly your right to do so, but that's not the main. So you get the sense. And also she's a Californian, not a New Yorker. So this comes back in all of her writing, going back to California. So you're going to be able to pay the cost, right? When you're young, you have energy and health. I still believed in possibility, in a sense so peculiar to New York, that something extraordinary would happen any minute, any day, any month. I was making only $65 or $70 a week then. So little money that some weeks I had to charge food at Bloomingdale's Gourmet Shop. Life's rough, right? Charge food at Bloomingdale's Gourmet Shop in order to eat. A fact which went unmentioned in the letters I wrote to California. I never told my father that I needed money, because then he would have sent it and I would never know if I could do it by myself. I'm going to skip some sentences here. Go to the next paragraph. Nothing was irrevocable. Everything was within reach. That's semicolon in between. That's one. Nothing was irrevocable. Everything was in reach. Just around every corner lay something curious and interesting. Something I had never before seen or done or known about. The two best sentences in the English language right there. I'm going to repeat that. Nothing was irrevocable. Everything was within reach. Just around every corner lay something curious and interesting. Something I had never before seen or done or known about. I could go to a party and meet someone who called himself Mr. Emotional Appeal. and ran the Emotional Appeal Institute, or a Florida cracker who was then a regular on what he called the Big C, the Southampton El Morocco circuit. I'm well connected on the Big C, honey. That's in quotes. Some guy she meets, I don't know, at a party. He would tell me over collard greens on his vast borrowed terrace, or the window of the celery cane of the Harlem market, or a piano salesman from Bonne Terre, Missouri, or someone who had already made and lost 2 fortunes in Midland, Texas. I could make promises to myself and to other people, and there would be all the time in the world to keep them. I would stay up all night and make mistakes, and none of it would count. So she brings back to her, none of it would count, mean I do all these wasteful things, and it would not cost me. You know, this idea of having health to burn, energy to burn. These are cliches, after all, she's writing. So that's you could say that's the transparent part, the message. I'm trying to get us away from the message in here and towards, it's sort of a suspension of the need for a goal. I want us to suspend conclusion and dwell in the poetry of the writing, if that's just kind of, it makes any sense at all. There's a lot here. I'm gonna where are we here? So that's just a piece on New York, you know. Trying to get organized while I do the stream. Now, I think we're going to dig a little into some BlueNights, finally. I'm going to show you some of the text because this is in part a visual aspect of prose. It's very important in Joan Didion's writing. How many paragraphs and use of italics. All these things are completely missed if you listen to this, read. So see here, see? Chapter 13, see how for everything there is a season. The birds and mamas and papas, do you want to dance? She's talking about her daughter Quintana Roo sitting on the bare hardwood floors, house on Franklin Avenue. I miss having the seasons. People from New York like to say by way of indicating the extraordinary pride they take in not living in Southern California. And then she goes on, of course, to correct the reader in her aggressive tone. I'm going to read it. In fact, Southern California does have seasons. It has, for example, the fire season, or the season when the fire comes. And it also has the season when the rain comes. But such Southern California seasons, as arriving as they do so theatrically as to seem strokes of random fate, do not inexorably suggest the passage of time. Those other seasons, the ones so prized on the East Coast, do. Seasons in Southern California suggest violence, but not necessarily death. Seasons in New York, the relentless dropping of the leaves, the steady darkening of the days, the blue nights themselves, suggest only death. For my having a child there was a season. That season passed. I have not yet located the season in which I do not hear her crooning back to the 8-track. The 8-track deck. So I was talking about her little girl singing along with the birds, turn, turn, turn. And the mamas and the papas. So that's very elegiac. Remember when my little girl did this? And she's making art, after all, prose, form of art, out of the most personal of her experiences. And it's, in its own way, identical to writing about John Wayne or New York and California, because it's what's personal to her, mediated. It's important. This is the part that's a little more, creates a little bit of opacity, mediated through this thing we call prose. It's not somebody telling you how it is. It's not raw. It's not immediate. It's cooked. At least in this context. There are more immediate forms of art where the goal is to be as raw as possible. And that becomes a kind of virtue. That's a romantic view. Some stand-up comedy is that way. Some performance art is that way. And we could talk about that in other contexts. And so here we go. Here's a good example of what I'm talking about. See? I took the glass and put it down. I had not considered the need for a bassinet. I had not considered the need for a layette. Then down later here, she says, dreaming, in other words, that I had failed, been given a baby and failed to keep her safe. It's this theme. Like, did I keep her safe? Again, on this question of fear. So you have a clause on this question of fear. And then after that, a longer paragraph where she talks about what people say about being a parent and being fearful for your kid. For your... So she says, when I began writing these pages, I believe they're subject to be children. The ones we have and the ones we wish we had. The ways in which do we depend on our children depend on us. The ways in which we encourage them to remain children. The ways in which they remain more unknown to us than they do to their most casual acquaintances. The ways in which we remain equally opaque, there's our word, to them. The ways in which, for example, we write novels just to show each other. The ways in which our investments in each other remain too freighted ever to see the other clear. The ways in which neither we nor they can bear to contemplate the death or the illness or even the aging of the other. You can see the flow. It's just comes out. It comes out of the Bible and all the poetry, of course. Here's another passage in which, as I said, aggression is not quite what the word. Joan Didion telling the reader, this is how I feel or how it feels to me. If you label and judge me, which you are wont to do, you might be wrong. Don't be so sure. It's in that genre of I can find it. It's always a good idea to read what you do find. So there's this thing where she says, when we talk about mortality, we are talking about our children. And then that's italicized, and then next paragraph, little short paragraphs. It's like a paragraph a sentence, you know. I just said that, but what does it mean? All right, of course I can track it. Of course you can track it. Another way of acknowledging that our children are hostages to fortune. But when we talk about our children, what are we saying? See how she's going into the lower register? I don't mean in pitch, I mean style. Very casual. She's dropping down into almost like something you would see in Notes to John in the diary a little bit. But she's using that to go into the right? All right, of course I could track it. Of course you could track it. Another way of acknowledging that our children are hostages to fortune. But when we talk about our children, what are we saying? Are we saying that it means to us to have them? What it meant to us not to have them? What it meant to let them go? Or are we talking about the enigma of pledging ourselves to protect the unprotectable? About the whole puzzle of being a parent? Time passes. Both words italicized. Time passes. Have I been saying it the same way I say I have lived most of my life in California? And she goes on. So that's you can sense the Chapter 18, and back to the subject. We never left it, of anxiety about being a parent. Now this is quite a long paragraph, so she doesn't always see. This is the whole page. Is just see this one. I'm going to read this. So she does that. When she needs to do that, for that moment. Open that. I do not know many people who think they have succeeded as parents. Those who do tend to cite the markers that indicate their own status in the world, the Stanford degree, the Harvard MBA, the summer with the white shoe law firm. Those of us less inclined to compliment ourselves on our parenting skills, in other words, most of us, recite rosaries of our failures, our neglects, our derelictions and delinquencies. The very definition of success as a parent has undergone a telling transformation. We used to define success as the ability to encourage the child to grow into independent, which is to say into adult, life, to raise the child, to let the child go. If a child wanted to try out his or her new bicycle on the steepest hill in the neighborhood, there may have been a pro forma reminder that the steepest hill in the neighborhood descended into a four-way intersection, but such a reminder, because independence was still seen as the desired end of the day, stopped short of nagging. If a child elected to indulge in activity that could end badly, such negative possibilities may have gotten mentioned once, but never twice. That's a way of raising a kid, the way I was raised. Gen X. I don't need to tell you if you're younger and if you're born in the 90s and that you were probably raised differently. And I'm not making any evaluations. These are just, I'm being very relativistic. These are just styles. And in prose, she says, it so happened that I was a child during World War II. Now, she's talking about her silent generation. I was a child during World War II, which meant that I grew up in circumstances in which even more stress than usual was placed on independence. I don't know if I'm going to read all this because it is interesting. My father was a finance officer in the Army Air Corps, and during the early years of the war, my mother and brother and I followed him from Fort Lewis in Tacoma to Duke University in Durham to Peterson Field and Colorado Springs. This was not hardship, but neither was it given the overcrowding and dislocation that characterized life near American military facilities in 1942 and 1943, a sheltered childhood. In Tacoma, we were lucky enough to rent what was called a guest house, but was actually one large room with its own entrance. In Durham, we again lived in one room. This one not large and not with its own entrance, in a house that belonged to a Baptist preacher and his family. This room in Durham came with kitchen privileges, which amounted in practice to occasional use of the family's apple butter. In Colorado Springs, we lived for the first time in an actual house, a 4-room bungalow near a psychiatric hospital, but did not unpack. There was no point in unpacking, my mother pointed out, since orders, a mysterious concept that I took on faith, could arrive any day. I guess to leave or with the military, it's like kind of being a military person, family. This is another use of the repetition. Repetition either at the beginning of a sentence or a clause or at the end. And isocolons. I'm just doing this in medias res, so what if the damage extends beyond the physical? She's talking about her own aging now, not Quintana. So just the context. What if the damage extends beyond the physical? It's her worrying, okay? What if the problem is now cognitive? What if the absence of style that I welcomed at one point, the directness that I encouraged, even cultivated, what if this absence of style has now taken on a pernicious life of its own? What if my new inability to summon the right word, the apt thought, the connection that enables the words to make sense, the rhythm, the music itself, what if this new inability is systemic? What if I can never again locate the words that work? So she's reflecting on her own abilities as a writer at the end of her life, because she's at the end here. She writes this and she knows that she is. And then she goes to see a neurologist. So what I want to say is all this is mixed together. California, New York, how she was raised, Quintana's passing, and her Quintana's admittedly wild lifestyle. These are all mixed together. Worrying about your kid's own worries about monsters and boogeymen in the closet at night. These are all mixed together. They're all subjects for a writer, for this writer. Here's another passage. This is the despite all the evidence passage. I'm going to read some of it. Despite all the evidence. Despite recognizing that my skin and my hair and even my cognition are all reliant on the estrogen I no longer have. Despite recognizing that I will not again wear the red suede sandals with the 4-inch heels, and despite recognizing that the gold hoop earrings and the black cashmere leggings and the enamel beads no longer exactly apply. Despite recognizing that for a woman my age, even to note such details of appearance will be construed by many as a manifestation of misplaced vanity. Despite all that, nonetheless, that being 75 could present as a significantly altered situation. An altogether different it did not until recently occur to me. You can see the precision of that passage, and despite all the evidence, I'm talking about writing on her 75th birthday. So the meticulous precision this is the quality of this text that makes it valuable. I suspect also makes it not so approachable by many, 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 many people who would want a text that's sloppier and more real, perhaps, or more useful, perhaps. Again, none of these are my views. I'm just saying, I'm trying to understand when a text, when a work of art lands, how it's received. But she's the only one doing this, so there's that too. So there's often value in doing something because you're the only cat doing it, you know. No one else is doing it. I mean, there's many things to consider. I'm considering some of them here. I can't, you know, this is just one text that ends a writer's life. We can't, you know, cover everything. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of how Joan Didion does things with words. This material here about moving back and forth New York, California. These two places. That she's wrestling with, I don't feel like I'm moving back. John, her husband, John always said we moved back to New York. I never did. Two separate paragraphs, right? I see it this way, he sees it this other way because of our difference in experience. There's a sense that I want to go back to an older sample. Because I do think it's all mixed together. And I think We talked about places. Now we're going to talk about eras again. Should I read from the women's movement? Women's movement is one of her most hated texts because, well, she writes it as a Goldwater Republican and is not a advocate for that movement. Bearing in mind that she's an author who has immense sympathy and strong sympathy for Martha Stewart during Martha Stewart's crises. Complex thinker. I don't know if I'm going to read from that. I want to. No, I'm gonna stay with eras here. Shoot. On the morning after the 60s. That's a great title, right? So it's 60s are over. Cielo Drive happened, you know, Manson murder. And this is, let's dig into this. I am talking here about being a child of my own time. When I think about the 60s now, I think about an afternoon not of the 60s at all. An afternoon early in my sophomore year at Berkeley. A bright autumn Saturday in 1953. I was lying on a leather couch in a fraternity house. There had been a lunch for the alumni. My date had gone on to the game. I do not now recall why I had stayed behind. Lying there alone, reading a book by Lionel Trilling and listening to a middle-aged man pick out a piano in need of tuning the melodic line to Blue Room. All that afternoon we sat at the piano, and all that afternoon he played Blue Room, and he never got it right. I can hear and see it still, the raw note, and we will thrive on, keep alive on. The sunlight falling through the big windows, the man picking up his drink and beginning again and telling me, without ever saying a word, something I had not known before about bad marriages and wasted time and looking backward. That such an afternoon would now seem implausible in every detail. The idea of having had a date for a football lunch now seems to me so exotic as to be almost czarist. That's the Russian Empire czar, czarist, C-Z-A-R-I-S-T. Suggests the extent to which the narrative on which many of us grew up no longer applies. The distance we have come from the world in which I went to college was on my mind quite a bit during those seasons when not only Berkeley but dozens of other campuses were periodically shut down, incipient battlegrounds, their borders sealed. We were all very personal then, sometimes relentlessly so. And at that point, when we either act or do not act, most of us still are. Most of us still are. I suppose I am talking about just that, the ambiguity of belonging to a generation distrustful of political highs. The historical irrelevancy of growing up convinced that the heart of darkness lay not in some error of social organization, but in man's own blood. If man was bound to err, then any social organization was bound to be in error. What a great sentence. If man was bound to err, then any social organization was bound to be in error. It was a premise which still seems to be accurate enough, but one which robbed us early of a certain capacity for surprise. She's writing that in 1970, and that point of view is of somebody who was not a hippie and not a member of the New Left, because those are things a little bit younger than her. Those are boomer things in the context of this era. And she's looking at it and saying, well, you folks think things are perfectible and think problems are caused by structures. And she's saying here, I think the opposite. I think it's what's bred in the bone, to quote Robertson Davies, or Iago, Othello, it's in him. As she quotes in Plays Delays, I don't ask what makes Iago evil. Other people can ask that question. I never asked that, which is how that novel opens, and it's the same thing here. So there's a kind of polemical quality there, and yet 30 years later, in writing down the Dukakis campaign, writing on the awfulness to her, the awfulness of Nancy Reagan, and the Reagan Revolution, she's nevertheless saying these structures have problems, and they cause bad things to happen. They cause bad things to happen for the innocent accused in the Central Park case. The Central Park rape and mugger case of the 80s, in which she wrote about that and disagreed with the verdict of that case, and knew that those people were innocent of the attack on the jogger. And so you cannot get a more left-wing text than her essay on that case. Of course, that's after she had converted parties and became a Democrat, but there's still some of this in there too, because there's a sense of character and responsibility and will and all the rest of it. And how one was raised, her essay on self-respect. One of the great Emersonian essays. I may bring it out now and start reading it maybe. So I was going to play a clip from Griffin Dunne, her nephew's film of BlueNights, but I'm going to wait a little bit because I turned off the TV mainly, and say to think about prose as a style that makes us feel things, that comes from the inside, not a machine. It involves careful culinary cultivation, cooking, not raw, because you're creating paragraphs and adverbs and adjectives and prepositions and infinitives and all this stuff to create stuff on a page that we read. And all of this reflects the era in which those things, all those things I just mentioned meant something. And they were intended for us now, here, today, on the 25th of July in 2025 and tomorrow and years to come, if we are open enough and willing enough to suspend our own desires and suspend our own goals and expectations and a fetish for transparency, and enter into this world of literary art, then we can go on this journey as we did today partly. And if I was overly polemical, I apologize. I'm trying to talk about very complex things in a succinct way. And I do hope you have the best weekend you can. And many like and subscribe to our channel, and many things are coming up. I think it's wonderful. I really, really, really enjoyed on the 29th my conversation with Alex Carter, the painter from Los Angeles and San Diego, Alexandra Carter, in a week in which we discussed two powerhouse movies, The Substance and The Last Showgirl. And we talked for 2 hours, and that was well, you'll see. Connects to some themes in this very episode. So we will return with episode 3 of Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunne, and we're going to have a guest. I don't know when. Joanne Davis Woods is going to be a guest, but it'll be soon. And we're going to have, I'd say, maybe 2 more episodes. 2 or 3. And then we will move on to say goodbye to this and move on to other things. Well, thank you.